We tend to think of history like a comic book. Heroes on one side, villains on the other, the end. But that is not how things work in real life. People are too complex to be squeezed into a neat little box. Yet history has a habit of conveniently forgetting the messy, ugly, and sometimes horrifying details that don't fit the legend. From the bizarre to the disgusting to the downright horrifying, here are 15 dark secrets about famous historical figures you won't believe. Let's start off with Number 15. Alexander Graham Bell. Everyone knows Alexander Graham Bell as the genius who gave us the telephone. Without him, we wouldn't have smartphones, endless group chats, or scam calls about our car's extended warranty. You'd think a man so devoted to communication would be all about inclusivity and bringing people together. But here's where it gets twisted. Bell hated the deaf community and wanted them erased. He wasn't just a casual opponent, he was a full-blown anti-deaf activist. He believed deaf people were a threat to society and pushed for some truly horrifying policies. Bell tried to ban sign language, fire deaf teachers from schools, and prohibit deaf people from marrying each other. His key goal? To wipe out deaf culture entirely. And just when you think it couldn't get worse, he supported forced sterilization of deaf individuals. That's right. The man who connected the world was also a hardcore eugenicist, trying to cut off an entire group of people from existence. Number 14. King Edward VII. England's King Edward VII spent the early 20th century doing all the usual kingly duties, signing treaties, waving at crowds, and generally looking regal. But what really put him on the map wasn't his statesmanship. It was his insane extracurricular activities. After falling out with his mother, Queen Victoria, who blamed him for his father's death, no big deal, Edward basically decided, screw it. He went full hedonist, embarking on a decades-long sex spree that would make modern-day rock stars look like choir boys. We're talking royal wife-swapping, champagne baths with prostitutes, and commissioning a custom-built sex chair to accommodate his, let's say, generous figure. Yes, the king was a bit on the hefty side, and apparently, bedroom activities were too much cardio for him. His solution? A lavishly designed, three-person love seat that allowed him to get busy without breaking a sweat. Nothing says monarchy like a throne strictly for debauchery. Number 13. Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens. The name alone screams literary greatness. He gave us A Tale of Two Cities, Oliver Twist, and of course, A Christmas Carol. You'd think the guy who invented Ebenezer Scrooge's redemption arc would be a beacon of kindness himself, right? Well, not exactly. Turns out, Dickens was less of a storyteller and more of an absolute menace when it came to real life. His idea of fun involved some of the most obnoxious pranks imaginable. He spoke in a fully made-up language just to confuse people. He'd run up to strangers, shout nonsense riddles in their faces, and then run away like an unhinged Victorian TikToker. But his antics took a dark turn during one particularly insane beach trip. Dickens randomly grabbed a young lady, dragged her to the water, and threatened to kill her. Why? Because he had fallen in love with her and decided they must die together. Number 12. King Tut. When archaeologist Howard Carter cracked open King Tut's tomb in 1922, he unleashed an icon. The boy king became the face of ancient Egypt, synonymous with wealth, power, and golden sarcophagi. But surprise! The real Tut was less a mighty ruler and more a walking medical disaster. Modern DNA tests revealed a grim reality. Tut's parents were brother and sister, because royalty, and that whole keeping it in the family thing left him with some serious defects. The young pharaoh suffered from a clubfoot, a severe overbite, skeletal deformities, and hips so comically wide he needed a walking stick just to get around. The Tutankhamun we see in paintings, standing tall and looking heroic? Yeah, pure ancient propaganda. So, while history loves to paint him as an all-powerful ruler, The truth is that he probably needed an entire royal support staff just to help him get up from his throne. Number 11. H.G. Wells. When you think of H.G. Wells, the man behind The War of the Worlds and The Time Machine, you picture a nerdy bookworm lost in thought. A shy, bespectacled intellectual, maybe a little awkward, probably too busy thinking about Martians to think about sex. Yeah, no. H.G. Wells had more sex than you will ever have, fantasize about, or read in a romance novel. After a rather dull childhood in 19th century England, Wells made up for lost time by dedicating himself to a lifetime of, well, extracurricular research. He detailed every conquest in his personal journal, which reads less like a diary and more like a scandalous Victorian tabloid. He described the daughter of a close friend as most interestingly hairy, and another lover as insatiable. One Australian novelist was seduced on top of a negative review she'd received, which Wells promptly burned after they finished. And let's not forget his self-appointed bedroom nickname, Your Lord, the Jaguar. Yep, the father of modern science fiction was basically a time-traveling Casanova. Number 10. Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh wasn't just a legendary aviator, he was basically the 1920s equivalent of a rock star. His groundbreaking 1927 solo flight across the Atlantic made him the global golden boy. People worshipped him. He was the human embodiment of adventure and triumph. But apparently, when you can literally fly away from your problems, temptation gets a little too easy to indulge. Lindbergh wasn't just a family man, he was 3 family men. That's right. The world's most famous pilot was secretly juggling 3 entire families across multiple countries, none of whom knew about each other. His mistresses included his secretary, Valeska, as well as 2 sisters in Munich, Germany. And he didn't just sneak around, he fathered children with all of them. His routine? He'd pop in, play doting dad for a few days, and then literally take off. His secret kids only ever knew him by a fake name. That's not just being a player, that's maintaining 3 separate soap opera storylines while being an international icon. He was a real madman. Number 9. Mother Teresa. Say the name Mother Teresa, and most people picture a saintly lady dedicating her life to the poor and sick. She was canonized in 2016, officially becoming Saint Teresa of Calcutta. But dig a little deeper, and her version of compassion starts to look a lot more like cruelty. Mother Teresa believed that suffering was holy, that pain brought people closer to Jesus. So rather than trying to heal the sick, she let them rot. In her many clinics, patients were denied painkillers, open wounds were left untreated, and suffering was actively encouraged. Dying in agony? According to Mother Teresa, that was a blessing. And it wasn't just her twisted philosophy. Her facilities were dangerously unfit to treat anyone. She refused to allow medical training for her volunteers because she believed God empowers the weak and ignorant. Needles were reused, basic sanitation was ignored, and even curable patients were left to waste away. Well, what else we can say except, holy crap. We mean, do we really live in reality? Number 8. Tibetan monks. When you think of Tibetan monks, you probably picture peaceful red-robed men meditating in the mountains, spreading wisdom, and practicing compassion. The Dalai Lama himself is literally a Nobel Peace Prize winner. But before 1959, Tibetan Buddhism wasn't all serenity and enlightenment. It was brutal, feudal, and downright tyrannical. For centuries, Tibet wasn't a spiritual haven. It was a dictatorship run by monks. These so-called holy men weren't just leaders. They were ruthless overlords who ruled the country through fear, heavy taxation, and outright slavery. If you weren't a monk living in one of their extravagant palaces, you were basically expendable. Kidnapping, rape, and torture were just part of the system. Speaking out against the lamas, that could get you your hamstrings cut or your eyeballs removed. The actual reason this reign of terror ended? China's 1950 invasion of Tibet. The communist takeover toppled the monks' regime, forcing them to abandon their tyrannical ways and rebrand as the peaceful, smiling symbols of wisdom we recognize today. So, never believe in history. Number 7. Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant is hailed as a Civil War hero, a man who fought alongside Lincoln to crush the Confederacy and end slavery in the U.S. His leadership helped win the war, and his presidency was seen as a victory for justice. But here's the part that didn't make it into your high school history books. Grant was also a dedicated white supremacist. While he did believe slavery was evil, good start, he also believed different races could never peacefully coexist, not so great. His solution wasn't equality, it was mass deportation. Grant proposed rounding up all newly freed Black Americans, millions of them, and forcibly shipping them off to an isolated island in the Caribbean. His grand plan? Buy Santo Domingo, modern-day Dominican Republic, for $1.5 million and relocate 4 million former slaves there. Shockingly, a terrifying number of people supported this idea before it ultimately fell apart. So while Grant did help end slavery, his idea of a post-racial America was just America without Black people in it. We people can be crazy. Number 6. Hans Christian Andersen. Hans Christian Andersen gave the world some of the most beloved childhood stories: The Little Mermaid, The Ugly Duckling, The Snow Queen, which later became Frozen. His legacy is pure, magical, and full of wonder. But Andersen himself? He was less storybook prince and more awkward, lonely, and extremely into himself, literally. Andersen was painfully shy, socially awkward, and so terrified of intimacy that he never actually attempted sex. That didn't mean he didn't have an active imagination, though. Instead of, meeting people, he developed a lifelong obsession with solo adventures and kept a detailed log of every single session in his personal diary. He even recorded who inspired the moment, making his journal read less like a work of literature and more like a very concerning watch history. He also had a habit of visiting brothels, not to do anything, but just to talk to the women. Then he'd go home, take care of business, and make another diary entry, sometimes with just 2 haunting words. Well, you can Google them. Number 5. Vlad the Impaler. Vlad III Dracula, yes, that Dracula, wasn't just a ruthless 15th century ruler of Wallachia. He was a one-man medieval horror show. Sure, he defended his homeland from the Ottoman Turks, but his favorite pastime? Turning enemies into human kebabs. Impaling was his thing. Victims were skewered on massive wooden stakes, carefully avoiding vital organs to keep them alive just long enough to suffer. After one battle, he left 20,000 corpses on display, creating a literal forest of death. When the next wave of invaders showed up, they took one look and noped out of there. Rumors say he dined among the impaled, even dipping his bread in their blood. That, plus his Transylvanian roots and the whole Dracula name, no wonder Bram Stoker turned him into a vampire. The real Vlad was already a nightmare. Number 4. Rasputin. Grigory Rasputin wasn't just a mystic. He was a full-blown scandal magnet. This self-proclaimed holy man convinced Russia's Tsarina that he could heal her sick son, worming his way into royal influence. Meanwhile, he preached that salvation came through sin, which, conveniently, gave him the perfect excuse for his wild sex life and legendary debauchery. Drunken parties? Check. Shameless womanizing? Check. Whispering into the ears of Russian rulers while face-deep in corruption? Oh, absolutely. Fearing he was wrecking Russia, a group of aristocrats plotted his murder in 1916. First, they poisoned him, nothing. Then, they shot him, still alive. Panicked, they beat him, shot him again, and tossed him into the frozen Neva River. When they fished him out, turns out he actually drowned. They had to kill him 3 times before it finally stuck. Number 3. Gilles de Rais. Gilles de Rais was a French war hero and a trusted ally of Joan of Arc. But off the battlefield, he was one of history's worst serial killers. By the 1430s, de Rais had a terrifying hobby, luring young boys to his castle under the guise of employment, only to torture, murder, and mutilate them in ways too gruesome to describe. Some were strangled, others were beheaded, and he was even said to kiss their severed heads. There were also whispers of satanic rituals and blood sacrifices. His crimes were ignored for years until he picked a fight with the church over a land dispute. Big mistake. That triggered an investigation, and soon his nightmare empire was exposed. He was hanged and burned in 1440, but not before confessing to at least 140 murders. Some believe his life inspired the Bluebeard folktale, but even that story is tame compared to the real guy. Number 2. Tomás de Torquemada. If you were alive in 15th century Spain, the last name you wanted to hear was Torquemada. As head of the Spanish Inquisition, he turned religious persecution into an industry. His specialty? Torture and execution. Suspected heretics were strangled, stretched on the rack, and waterboarded. The infamous strapado involved suspending victims by their wrists until their arms dislocated. And for those deemed beyond saving, the grand finale was public execution, usually by burning. Torquemada also spearheaded the mass expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain. Even converts weren't safe. If you even looked like you might be practicing your old religion in secret, you could end up on a pyre. Under his reign, thousands were executed. The Inquisition dragged on for centuries, but Torquemada remains its most infamous architect of cruelty. Number 1. Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth Bathory wasn't just a serial killer, she was a full-on horror story. This 16th century Hungarian noblewoman is said to have murdered up to 600 girls in the most nightmarish ways possible. She lured peasant girls to her castle with job offers, then tortured them for sport. Some were stabbed, beaten, or starved. Others were stripped naked and left to freeze in the snow. But the most infamous claim? She bathed in their blood, believing it kept her young. For years she got away with it, until she got cocky and started killing noble girls. That was a mistake. Instead of execution, she got a worse fate, bricked up inside her castle and left to rot alone. She died 4 years later. Some say she was framed by political enemies, but when your nickname is the Blood Countess, let's be real, you probably earned it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you soon in the next one.